There's a joke about degrees in philosophy, where the people majoring in philosophy get asked, would you like fries with that? Getting a degree in philosophy is supposed to be such a waste of time and money because philosophy ostensibly does not provide a utilitarian skill set. This claim was compellingly countered by The Atlantic magazine in 2015, which found that they had an average mid-career income of $82,000. It indicates that while philosophers can seem like marginal people, if not frivolous, they can make their contributions felt while we mock them. In this list, we're going to be focusing on philosophers from the previous century. Philosophers from 2 or 3 centuries ago seem to get all of the attention, not to mention all the philosophers from about 2 millennia ago. Some of these names will be familiar, but as we've learned time and time again here at TopTenz, cultural osmosis is not very reliable. Number 10. Ludwig Wittgenstein. Born in Vienna, Austria in 1889 to a wealthy family of musicians, in his youth, the strongest desire of Wittgenstein's heart was to work in engineering, specifically as it related to the infant technology of motorized flight. Wittgenstein happened to get hung up on pure mathematics and went to Cambridge to be taught by Bertrand Russell himself. It would be during a 1908 retreat in Norway in a cabin he built that Wittgenstein would have the inspiration for the picture theory of meaning that would make him famous after he fought in World War I and got a job as an elementary school teacher for 6 years in 1920 because he had divested himself of his inheritance in 1919. Wittgenstein laid out his picture theory of meaning in his 1921 book Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which, in brief, says that unless a statement could be translated from an abstraction into an arrangement of objects, then it has no meaning. It was a literalism that could be expected of a philosophically minded engineer and which he also applied to the classroom. He had students perform such hands-on learning as constructing models and dissecting animals and applying corporal punishment to a degree that compelled him to lie about it and quit his job. Wittgenstein reinforced the point of applied philosophy with his other book of philosophy that's held up as a classic, Philosophical Investigations, written in 1953. Wittgenstein said that actions were the only way that a person could follow their ethics. It is not possible to obey a rule privately, otherwise thinking one was obeying a rule would be the same thing as obeying it. It's a harsh rebuke against people who claim to be above others but don't participate in the world around them or convince themselves that what matters is who they are on the inside. Number 9. Hiratsuka Raichō. For this philosopher, born in 1886, her feminist beliefs that would one day change the face of Japan were initially born more of religion than pure humanism. She had been taught that all people were equal, and naturally that meant that all women must be equal to all men, despite the fact they lacked key civil rights. It wasn't until she read the work of Ellen Key that she began to think of women as deserving equal rights for purposes of autonomy and individualism. As she wrote in her autobiography, women had been the sun, but society had reduced them to a wan and sickly moon, dependent on another, reflecting another's brilliance. The single most significant action Raichō undertook was founding and editing Saito, a literary magazine that ran from 1911 to 1916. She continued campaigning after seeing the appalling conditions of textile factories, which tended to employ primarily female crews. In 1920, she founded the New Women's Association. They were able to almost pass women's suffrage in 1921, and in 1922 successfully pressured the government to amend the Public Order and Police Law. Although her goal of suffrage wasn't achieved until 1945, her efforts still got her elected president of the Women's Federation in 1953. All of this was achieved with an attitude that was surprisingly carefree about public attitude. In 1908, she scandalously accompanied her platonic best friend to a mountain for a ritual suicide with an attitude of curiosity about what it was like to die, and because she suspected her partner would lose his willingness to kill himself when push came to shove. It was the sort of combination of deep conviction and apathy to social pressure that is often significant to bringing about change. Number 8. Noam Chomsky. There are 2 movies about long-term Massachusetts Institute of Technology linguist Noam Chomsky that, between them, encapsulate his 2 main areas of interest. Manufacturing Consent from 1992, an analysis of the profit-driven and narrative-driven media and US foreign policy, and Is the Man Who Is Tall Happy from 2013, a series of interviews where Chomsky asks and answers philosophical questions about language. Chomsky's basic beliefs relate to how controlling media can be used to create public approval of what basic human nature would and wouldn't be acceptable. In a televised debate with William Buckley, he argued that the US's excuse for occupying South Vietnam, saying that it was for the good of the Vietnamese people, was an excuse that had been used since ancient Roman times. Manufacturing Consent also devoted much of its runtime to how the media would withhold coverage of the Indonesian invasion of East Timor because it served elite interests to ignore it. One of the core values of Chomsky's political commentary and his stated views on language is to always question the narrative that's being provided. He goes so far as to say that during his childhood in the 1930s, he went to a school that was well suited to him before he went to high school because he was given freedom in classes to question instead of being given a highly regimented curriculum. Number 7. Jacques Derrida. Lately, the word deconstruction has been thrown around a lot more in the media. We can attribute the popularity of that phrase to a man born in French Algeria in 1930, a man who flunked his own exams to become a licensed Parisian philosopher in 1952. And he badly flunked them too, a score of 5 out of 20, and he choked disastrously on the written portion. He would need 3 attempts to pass it in 1956, and after some time in the military, he spent decades teaching. It was while working in education that he would write the essays that made him famous in the English-speaking world. If Derrida's philosophical insight that made him so influential to be reduced to a logline, and bear in mind that this is someone who wrote 70 books and countless essays, it would be to critique other writers who claimed that they were being objective. Derrida said that was functionally impossible, as the education any analyst had received would introduce biases that would impact their view one way or another, which is a rebuke even of Chomsky's question everything philosophy, in that it argues there are only certain ways that questions can be asked, and which ones they will be depend on environment. Derrida's seemingly detached central tenet didn't mean he avoided controversial opinions, since he was both an admirer of Karl Marx and Martin Heidegger. Still, the impact of his deconstructionist philosophy can't be denied to anyone who has consumed a significant amount of postmodern media with significant meta-commentary. Number 6. Judith Jarvis Thompson. Whatever your views on the abortion controversy, there's no denying Thompson's influence over the issue in the United States of America. Born in 1929, by 1969 she was a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy. In 1971, she wrote A Defense of Abortion and went a long way to reframing the debate in a manner which put the feminist movement behind the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling. Its influence and controversy has led to her essay being dubbed the most widely reprinted essay in all of contemporary philosophy. The most momentous passage of Thompson's essay is a metaphor. Thompson asks the reader to imagine they woke up on life support, and the reader's kidneys are being used to support the life of a violinist in a coma. The reader is being used for this process because they're the only matching blood type. While the violinist certainly has the right to life, Thompson asserts that the reader would also have the right to their own body and potentially their own life. In doing so, she reframes the debate from focusing on the rights of the fetus to those of the parent. This is hardly her sole contribution to the philosophical landscape. She also redesigned the famous trolley problem, but the 1971 essay remains her most momentous piece of writing. Number 5. JeanPaul Sartre. Born in Paris in 1905, his body of work would, by the time of his death in 1980, would include books and plays such as Being and Nothingness and The Flies, which were key to spreading existential philosophy around the world. His most famous play, No Exit, coins the popular expression, "Hell is other people." Sartre rejected the label of existentialist for a long time, and in 1964 he rejected the Nobel Prize in Literature, criticizing its Eurocentrism. He came to regret this later rejection, in particular saying he could have donated the prize money to an anti-apartheid committee in London. Also in 1964 he renounced all literature as a substitute for taking meaningful action in the world. In short, he was a very passionate man of letters. Sartre was a nihilist when it came to human nature, as he outlined in Existentialism is Humanism. He argued that human beings, as autonomous and sentient entities, have to define themselves as they live, and they do so through their actions. Sartre was not positive about this state, calling it anguish. It's little wonder he felt that hell is other people. Number 4. Giovanni Gentile. The inclusion of any figure on this list is not an endorsement of their views, as is the case here. In 1932, this Italian philosopher, who was born in 1886, was literally a co-author for the doctrine of fascism with Benito Mussolini. This means, of course, he was indirectly helping write the blueprints for the much more destructive German fascism. He created a philosophical movement of his own, known initially as actual idealism, which was shortened to actualism. It was largely an extension of the work of the 19th century philosopher Georg Hegel. Gentile they argued that objective reality was unknowable and that individual identities were an illusion, which in turn he argued meant that the only way to find value was to bind oneself into a larger group. In a sense, it's a form of nihilism, since everything outside the group is unquantifiable and thus can't have a value. That also serves as a justification for submission. Number 3. Ayn Rand. Few people are as well known for their contradictions as this best-selling author born in Russia in 1905 who created the objectivist movement. She is highly lauded in right-wing circles despite being aggressively pro-choice. She believed only in wealth distribution through private charity, but is often mocked for accepting Social Security near the time of her passing in 1982. Her books, The Fountainhead, We the Living, Anthem, and Atlas Shrugged, are all endlessly derided and bought. Blockbuster director Zack Snyder plans to make a film adaptation of The Fountainhead. The contradictions of her life are a significant contributor to her mystique. Objectivism argues that the best way for humanity to proceed is for everyone to act in their rational self-interest. People will act ethically because it is in the best interest of capitalism for them to treat everyone ethically so that others will treat them ethically. Morality cannot be forced on anyone, and to use the threat of physical violence to compel people to act morally, for example, to use the threat of arrest to coerce citizens to give tax money that would be used to help the needy, is itself immoral. You can see how her philosophy would be the nemesis of socialist governments like the Soviet Union. Number 2. Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss has not become a household name since his death in 1973. Even among the circle that knew him at the time, he was more polarizing than most. Strauss is more influential because he was read by a few at the top than by many at the bottom or in the middle. From Gerald Ford to the Bushes, his work was taught and discussed in the White House every time there was a Republican in office. Even William Gaston, a domestic policy advisor to Bill Clinton for 2 years, was a student of him. Strauss believed that human beings do not have natural rights and they are inherently unequal and thus shouldn't be treated as if they are. He argued that society needed to have its noble lies, which was what Strauss considered to be religion. This was so that the lower classes would remain productive. He said science and philosophy must be the preserve of a small minority because science and philosophy are attempts to replace opinion, and opinion is the element in which society breathes. Number 1. Albert Camus. Like Derrida, he was born in Algeria, though in Camus' case in 1913. He also shared with Derrida a soft spot for communism, though that was out of his system by the time he was in France and made his name. As Derrida is said to be the father of deconstruction, Camus is credited with being one of the fathers of absurdism as a philosophical movement. Camus' first published book is 1942's The Stranger, a novel about a sociopathic man who neither cares about his mother's death nor understands why everyone else does. Accused of premeditated murder, what actually gets him sentenced to death is his apathy and his atheism. Before his execution, he tears into the priest sent to receive his confession and manages to find peace in accepting the meaninglessness of life. His most famous book, and what won him the Nobel Prize in Literature, is 1947's The Plague. It's a story of a bubonic plague epidemic in Oran, Algeria, based on a cholera epidemic that hit the town in 1849, and a metaphor for the presence of the Third Reich in France. It's the story of how society is broken down so that people isolate themselves in the hopes of riding the plague out while others fight against it. Even though Camus treats the struggle against the plague as absurd, it's clear that they have his sympathies. Camus' other work of non-fiction is The Myth of Sisyphus, a 130-page essay published in 1942 about the character from Greek mythology who is condemned to forever push a boulder up a mountain, a task impossible because in some versions it will always roll back down or just can't be moved in the first place. Camus argued that this was a perfect symbol for the human condition, forever pointlessly struggling since the inevitability of oblivion hangs over everyone and everything at all times. Rather than reaching a dour nihilistic conclusion from that, Camus said, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy. After all, he does have an eternal sense of purpose." In its way, Camus' absurdist philosophy is optimistic and an accepting form of nihilism. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below and do not forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Looking for something else from me? Why not check out my other channel, Biographics? You'll find a link to that below. And as always, thank you for watching.